I'm Easton Donnelly, 38, a decorated Army veteran who spent 15 years serving my country. Last Tuesday, my 8-year-old daughter, Emma, looked me in the eye and asked why I abandoned her to play Army, like her grandparents said I did. The words hit harder than any blast I'd survived in Afghanistan. For 3 years, my ex-wife's parents had been poisoning my children against me, painting my military service as selfish abandonment rather than sacrifice. They called my deployments playing soldier and my medals participation trophies, but they didn't know about the Bronze Star citation sitting in my safe, or the real reason I'd been stationed overseas for so long. What they were about to discover would change everything they thought they knew about duty, sacrifice, and the true meaning of protecting family. Sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought on foreign soil, they're fought in your own backyard, with the truth as your only weapon. The custody agreement sat on my kitchen table like a tombstone, its cold legal language a stark reminder of how quickly a life could crumble. 2 years ago, Sarah and I had been a family. Now I was relegated to every other weekend and Wednesday evenings. My time with Emma and Jake measured out in court-ordered increments. The divorce had been brutal, but not because of the usual reasons. Sarah and I had simply grown apart during my deployments, the distance and stress wearing away at our foundation like water on stone. We might have worked through it, gone to counseling, found our way back to each other, but her parents had other plans. Robert and Margaret Hardwell had never approved of my military career. From the moment Sarah brought me home, they'd made it clear they thought she could do better than a soldier. When our marriage started showing cracks, they didn't encourage reconciliation, they encouraged divorce. And when Sarah finally filed the papers, they made sure I understood exactly who they blamed for the failure. You chose the Army over your family, Margaret had spat during one particularly vicious custody hearing. You abandoned your wife and children to play soldier in some foreign country. Sarah deserves better. Those children deserve better. The judge had been sympathetic but bound by law. Sarah wasn't unfit, and her parents were prominent members of the community. Orbit owned the largest insurance agency in town, and Margaret sat on the school board. I was just another divorced dad fighting for scraps of time with his own children. What made it worse was watching Emma and Jake's confusion transform into something darker. At first, they'd run to me during visits, desperate for hugs and stories, but gradually, their enthusiasm cooled. They started asking pointed questions that sounded far too mature for their ages. "Daddy, why did you leave us to go fight wars?" Emma had asked just last month, her 7-year-old voice carrying an accusation that cut straight through me. "Grandpa says you chose the Army instead of us," Jake had added, his 6-year-old face serious beyond his years. I tried to explain how service meant protecting people like them, how sometimes soldiers had to go away to keep everyone safe. But how do you compete with daily indoctrination from grandparents who frame every sacrifice as selfish abandonment? The worst part was knowing that somewhere in my safe, locked away like classified intelligence, sat proof that their narrative was not just wrong, it was obscenely, tragically wrong. But that truth came with complications I wasn't sure I was ready to face. I enlisted the day after my 18th birthday, driven by a combination of patriotism, financial necessity, and the simple desire to serve something larger than myself. My own father had been Army, killed in Iraq when I was 16. I understood the risks, but I also understood the honor. The first decade of my career was everything I'd hoped for. I rose through the ranks steadily, earned my sergeant's stripes, and specialized in combat engineering. The work was dangerous but meaningful, building infrastructure, clearing explosives, making places safe for civilians and fellow soldiers alike. I met Sarah during my stateside assignment at Fort Campbell in 2016. She was working as a nurse at the base hospital, and I was recovering from a training injury that had laid me up for 2 weeks. She was beautiful, obviously, but what captured me was her laugh, genuine and bright, the kind that made everyone around her smile. Our courtship was intense and fast, the way military relationships often are, when you know deployment could separate you at any moment. We married 8 months later in a small ceremony at the base chapel. Emma came along 14 months after that, and Jake followed 2 years later. For a while, we managed the military life beautifully. Sarah understood the demands of my career, and I made every effort to be present when I was home. I coached Emma's first soccer team, taught Jake to ride his bike, helped with homework, and tucked him in every night I was stateside. But then came the deployment orders that would change everything. Afghanistan, 2018. What was supposed to be A standard 9-month rotation stretched into something much longer and more complex. The details were classified then, and some remain so now, but the basic truth was simple. My unit was involved in operations that required extended presence and specialized skills. Sarah handled the first deployment with her usual grace. We videoed every day I could manage it, and I sent packages filled with small toys and handwritten letters. Emma, barely 3 then, would kiss the laptop screen when we said goodbye. Jake was too young to understand much beyond daddy's at work. The second deployment was harder. The third broke something between us that we never quite managed to repair. I can't blame Sarah for struggling. Military wives carry an invisible burden that civilians rarely understand. They're single parents for months at a time, handling everything, from broken water heaters to sick children to parent-teacher conferences alone. They worry constantly about a knock on the door that might bring devastating news. And they do it all while maintaining the strength and optimism their families need to function. But what Sarah didn't know, what I couldn't tell her because of operational security, was that my deployments weren't always what they seemed. Sometimes I was exactly where she thought I was, doing exactly what she imagined. But sometimes the mission required something different, something that would later earn me recognition I never wanted, for actions I'd spent years trying to forget. The divorce papers cited irreconcilable differences, but the real reason was simpler and sadder. We'd become strangers living parallel lives, connected only by our love for our children and our mutual exhaustion from trying to bridge an ever-widening gap. The campaign to destroy my relationship with my children began subtly, the way all effective manipulation does. Robert and Margaret Hardwell were too smart to launch an obvious assault instead. They waged psychological warfare with the precision of career politicians that had started with innocent-seeming comments during my visitation periods. When I'd pick up Emma and Jake, Margaret would kiss them goodbye and say things like, "Be good for your daddy," while he's pretending to be a hero again. Or Robert would ruffle Jake's hair and joke, "Tell your old man we said hello from the real world, where people don't need guns to feel important." The children didn't understand the barbs then, but the poison was already working its way into their systems. As months passed, the attacks became more direct. Emma came home from a weekend at her grandparents' house with a drawing she'd made. What should have been a picture of our family was instead a crayon rendering of a man in uniform, standing far away from a house where a woman and 2 children looked out the window sadly. At the bottom, in her careful second-grade handwriting, she'd written, "Daddy playing war." When I asked her about it, she repeated words that were clearly not her own. "Grandpa says soldiers just like to play with big guns and pretend they're in movies. He says you could have stayed home and gotten a real job like Daddy Mike." Mike was Sarah's new boyfriend, a perfectly nice insurance adjuster who worked for Robert's company. Jake's corruption was even more heartbreaking because of his age. At 6, he was old enough to remember me, but young enough to be completely vulnerable to suggestion. During one visit, he asked me why I went away to hurt people instead of staying home to help people like Mommy does. "Who told you I hurt people?" I asked gently. "Grandma Margaret says soldiers are mean to kids in other countries. She says that's why you stayed away so long, because you liked being mean more than you liked being with us." I felt something crack inside my chest. Margaret had taken my service 15 years of protecting innocence, of building schools and hospitals, of risking my life to make the world safer for children, exactly like Emma and Jake had transformed it into something monstrous in my own son's mind. The systematic rewriting of history was breathtakingly thorough. My deployments became abandonment. My medals became participation trophies for playing army. My injuries became convenient excuses to stay away longer. Even my decision to serve became selfish because I'd chosen strangers over family. Robert was particularly skilled at the psychological manipulation. He'd take the children fishing and camping activities I'd done with them before my final deployment, and afterwards they'd tell me about real adventures with Grandpa as opposed to pretend adventures with Daddy. He bought them gifts I couldn't afford on my veterans' disability payments and made sure they understood the comparison. The most devastating part was watching my children's faces change when they looked at me. The unconditional love and admiration that had once shone in their eyes gradually gave way to confusion, then disappointment, then something approaching pity. They still loved me, but it was the kind of love you might feel for a family member who'd made terrible choices obligatory and tinged with embarrassment. Sarah, caught in the middle and overwhelmed by single parenthood, either didn't see what was happening or chose not to interfere. Her parents provided free childcare, financial support, and emotional stability during a difficult transition. Confronting them would have meant losing all of that, and she simply wasn't strong enough to fight battles on multiple fronts. But I was about to become much stronger than any of them imagined. The law office of Patricia Chambers occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian house downtown, its burgundy carpet and dark wood paneling suggesting both respectability and discretion. Patricia herself was a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair, and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen every variety of human mess and retained her capacity for outrage about injustice. Parental alienation, she said after I'd finished explaining my situation. That's what we call it when one party systematically undermines the child's relationship with the other parent. It's real, it's damaging, and it's incredibly difficult to prove in court. I leaned forward in the leather chair across from her desk. But there has to be something I can do. They're poisoning my kids against me. Patricia pulled out a yellow legal pad and began making notes. Tell me exactly what they're saying, and who's present when they say it. I need specifics, not generalizations. For the next hour, I recounted every incident I could remember, the snide comments during pickups, the children's repeated questions about why I'd abandoned them, the gradual transformation of their attitudes toward my service. Patricia listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. Here's your problem, she said finally. The Hartwells are smart. They're not making direct accusations they can't defend. They're framing your military service in the worst possible light. But they can point to real facts. You were deployed. You were away from your children. Your marriage did end. A judge might see their behavior as inappropriate, but not necessarily actionable. The word hit me like a punch to the gut. So there's nothing I can do. I didn't say that. Patricia set down her pen and looked at me directly. But we need evidence, documentation, recordings if possible, though Maryland is a two-party consent state, so that's tricky. What we really need is proof that their behavior is causing measurable harm to the children. She handed me her business card, a simple white rectangle with raised lettering. Start keeping a journal. Date, time, witnesses present, exact words spoken. If the children say something that sounds like coaching, write it down immediately. If you notice behavioral changes, document them. If their teachers or counselors express concerns, get it in writing. What about my service record? I asked. I have commendations, performance evaluations, letters from commanding officers. Doesn't that matter? Patricia's expression softened slightly. It might, in the right context. But remember, the Hartwells aren't claiming you were a bad soldier. They're claiming you were a bad father who chose the military over your family. Your service record, no matter how impressive, doesn't directly contradict that narrative. I felt the familiar weight of frustration settling on my shoulders. So I'm supposed to just document the damage while they continued destroying my relationship with my kids. You're supposed to build a case, Patricia said firmly. Look, I've been doing family law for 23 years. I've seen parental alienation destroy families. And I've also seen parents fight back successfully. But it takes time, patience, and ironclad evidence. The courts are reluctant to restrict grandparents' access to their grandchildren, unless the harm is clear and severe. As I walked back to my truck, Patricia's business card felt heavier in my pocket than it should have. The legal system that I'd served and protected seemed designed to enable the very people who were systematically destroying my family. But Patricia was right about one thing: I needed evidence. What she didn't know was that I already had evidence. Evidence that would not just refute the Hartwells' narrative, but expose it as a grotesque distortion of reality. The question was whether I was ready to use it, and what the cost of that truth might be. Afghanistan, March 15, 2019. The morning started like any other in Helmand Province dry heat building, even before sunrise. The smell of dust and diesel fuel, and the constant low-level tension that came with operating in hostile territory. Our unit had been conducting infrastructure assessments in a village about 40 kilometers from our forward operating base, helping local contractors plan a new school and medical clinic. I was reviewing foundation surveys with my team when Staff Sergeant Maria Santos approached with the expression, "Every soldier learns to read." Instantly controlled urgency that meant the situation had just changed dramatically. "Sergeant Donnelly, we've got a problem," she said quietly. Intel just picked up chatter about a coordinated attack on the civilian refugee camp, 5 clicks north. Mixed reports. But it sounds like they're trapped between insurgent forces and a minefield we didn't know existed. The refugee camp housed about 200 displaced families, mostly women and children, who'd fled fighting in neighboring provinces. They'd been there for 3 months. living in temporary shelters, while aid organizations worked to relocate them to safer areas. Now they were caught in the worst possible position, able to advance or retreat without walking into either enemy fire or explosives. "What's our mission?" I asked, though I already knew. Our unit specialized in explosive ordnance, disposal, and combat engineering. If there was a minefield between civilians and safety, we were the ones who'd have to clear it. The field report that would later accompany my Bronze Star citation described what happened next in the dry, technical language the military uses to contain horror within acceptable parameters. Sergeant Donnelly's unit successfully conducted emergency route clearance operations under hostile fire, enabling the evacuation of 186 civilian refugees with minimal casualties. What it didn't capture was the sound of children crying in a language I didn't speak but understood perfectly, or the way my hands shook as I identified and marked the locations of severe terror, anti-personnel mines that could turn a 7-year-old into scattered pieces of memory. It didn't describe the weight of knowing that every step forward might be my last, or the responsibility of leading my team through a corridor of death measured in inches. The minefield was a nightmare of overlapping patterns, old mines from the Soviet occupation, newer devices planted by Taliban forces, and improvised explosives designed to maximize civilian casualties. Standard doctrine would have called for air support and a methodical, multi-day clearing operation, but the civilians didn't have days, and air support couldn't distinguish between insurgents and refugees. In the growing chaos, Santos took point on communications, coordinating with base command and the evacuation helicopters while maintaining contact with the trapped civilians. Corporal James Wright handled perimeter security, watching for enemy movement while I worked. Private First Class Alexandra Kim assisted with mine detection and marking, her steady hands and sharp eyes invaluable in the precise work of staying alive. The first mine I found was buried 18 inches from where a toddler had been playing in the dirt. The second was directly in the path the refugees would need to take to reach the evacuation zone. By the time we'd marked a safe corridor 50 meters long, sweat was pouring down my face despite the morning chill, and my heart was beating so hard I was afraid it might trigger a SAP-activated device. But the real test came when we realized the corridor wasn't enough. The corridor we'd cleared would get most of the refugees to safety, but not all of them. A group of about 30 people, mostly elderly and disabled individuals who couldn't move quickly, were trapped in a section of the camp that required crossing an area so heavily mined that attempting clearance would take hours we didn't have. That's when I made the decision that would haunt my dreams and define my character for the rest of my life. "Santos, get command on the line," I said, checking my gear one final time. "Tell them I'm conducting manual escort operations for the remaining civilians." Manual escort operations. Military jargon for walking into a minefield with nothing but handheld detection equipment and the hope that your training would keep you alive long enough to save someone else. "Sergeant, that's suicide," Wright said flatly. "You can't clear that area fast enough too." "I'm not clearing it," I interrupted. "I'm walking them through it, one at a time." The look Santos gave me was the same one I'd later see in Sarah's eyes during our worst arguments, a mixture of admiration and fury at my willingness to risk everything for people who weren't my responsibility. But they were my responsibility. That's what wearing the uniform meant. That's what the oath I'd taken said, in words that allowed no room for interpretation or convenience. The first person I escorted was an elderly woman named Amara, whose granddaughter translated her whispered prayers. As we moved step by careful step through the maze of hidden death, she weighed maybe 90 pounds and clutched my arm with fingers that felt like bird bones, trusting me completely with her life. 15 minutes to get her to safety. 15 minutes of pure concentration, reading the ground like a book written in a language of disturbed soil and metallic signatures. When we reached the evacuation zone, she kissed my hand and said something in Pashto that made her granddaughter cry. 29 more people waited for their turn. By the fourth trip, my legs were shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. By the eighth, I was operating on pure instinct. My conscious mind shut down to prevent panic from interfering with the mechanical precision required to stay alive. The medical records in my safe would later document the toll-elevated heart rate that bordered on tachycardia, stress fractures in both feet from the unnatural gait required for mine detection, and early signs of what would eventually be diagnosed as complex PTSD. The last person I escorted was a boy about Jake's age, maybe 6 years old, whose parents had been killed in the fighting that displaced the camp. He held my hand with complete faith, chattering in broken English about wanting to be a soldier like me when he grew up. "Soldiers protect people," he said as we navigated the final stretch of cleared ground. "Like you protect me." That's when the mortar round landed. The explosion threw us both to the ground. And for a moment that stretched like hours, I thought we'd triggered a mine. But it was incoming fire from insurgent forces, who'd identified our evacuation route and were trying to disrupt it. The boy was unconscious but breathing, and I had what felt like liquid fire running down my left leg. Santos and Wright reached us within seconds, laying down suppressing fire while medics loaded the boy onto a stretcher. I tried to stand and discovered that shrapnel had opened my femoral artery, not an immediately fatal wound, but one that would require immediate surgery and weeks of recovery. The citation that accompanied my Bronze Star mentioned my gallantry and intrepidity in action against an armed enemy and my selfless dedication to the welfare of others. What it didn't mention was that I spent the next 4 months in military hospitals, first in Germany and then at Walter Reed, undergoing surgeries and physical therapy while struggling with nightmares that made sleep feel like another battlefield. Those 4 months became the extended deployment that Robert and Margaret Hartwell would later characterize as evidence of my abandonment and selfishness. The classified nature of the operation meant I couldn't explain to Sarah why I was gone so long, or why the Army had decided I needed additional consultation and evaluation before returning to active duty. By the time I came home, something fundamental had changed in my marriage, and I was too broken to figure out how to fix it. The text message came at 9:30 on a Thursday night, 3 days after Emma's painful question about abandonment. Sarah's name appeared on my phone screen, followed by words I hadn't expected to read. "We need to talk. Can you come over after the kids are asleep? It's important." I stared at the message for a full minute before responding. Sarah and I maintained cordial communication about scheduling and school events, but actual conversations, the kind that required privacy and time, had become rare since the divorce. Usually, when she said something was important, it meant problems with child support or changes to the custody arrangement. "Is everything okay?" I typed back. "Just come over, please." Sarah's house, our old house, the one I'd helped paint and landscape during happier times, looked different at night. Smaller somehow, as if it had shrunk to accommodate the reality of a family divided. She met me at the door wearing jeans and an old college sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in the messy bun that meant she'd been thinking hard about something. "Coffee?" she asked, leading me to the kitchen where we'd shared 1,000 casual conversations, back when our biggest worry was Emma's resistance to potty training. "Sure." I sat at the familiar table, noting the children's artwork on the refrigerator and the pile of mail that suggested Sarah was managing everything alone. As usual, she poured 2 cups and sat across from me, her hands wrapped around the ceramic mug like she was trying to draw warmth from it. "Easton, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." The tone in her voice, serious, slightly afraid, put me on immediate alert. "Okay, did you really just choose the Army over us? Over me and the kids?" The question hit me like a physical blow. "Sarah, where is this coming from?" Emma came home from my parents' house yesterday with questions I couldn't answer. She wanted to know why soldiers hurt people instead of helping them, and why you liked fighting more than being with your family. "And Jake," her voice cracked slightly, "Jake asked me if you were a bad person." I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar rage at Robert and Margaret's poison campaign. "What did you tell them?" "I told them you weren't a bad person, but that I didn't understand all the reasons you made, the choices you did." Sarah looked directly at me, and I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Genuine curiosity, instead of tired resignation. "But here's the thing, Easton. I realized I don't understand either." "Not really." She pulled out her phone and showed me a text thread. I hadn't seen messages between her and her mother from the past few weeks. Margaret's words were all there in black and white. "He chose playing soldier over being a father. Some men just can't handle the responsibility of family. Sarah's better off without someone so selfish." "My mother has been saying things like this for 2 years, Sarah said quietly, "and I've been letting her because I was angry at you. And it was easier to have someone else articulate that anger than to examine it myself." "Sarah, but yesterday, when Emma asked me those questions, I realized I couldn't actually explain to my own children why their father is supposedly such a terrible person. Because the man I married, the man I divorced, wasn't terrible at all. Distant sometimes, yes. Struggling with things he couldn't talk about, absolutely. But not selfish, not cruel, not someone who would abandon his family for fun." The kitchen fell silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of Sarah's coffee cup being set carefully on the table. "So I'm asking you directly," she continued. "Why did you stay away so long on that last deployment? Why couldn't you explain what was happening? And why do my parents seem to know things about your service that make them so confident you were just playing soldier while we fell apart at home?" I looked at this woman I'd loved, still loved in complicated ways, and realized that for the first time in years, she was actually asking me to tell her the truth instead of defending herself against it. "It's classified," I said finally. "Parts of it, anyway. But Sarah, if I could tell you everything, if I could explain what really happened over there, would you want to know, even if it changes how you see everything that happened between us?" She nodded slowly. "I think I need to know. For the kids, if nothing else. They deserve better than the story my parents are telling them." The call from Emma's school came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing job applications at the kitchen table. Mrs. Rodriguez, the guidance counselor, had a voice that managed to be both professional and genuinely concerned. "Mr. Donnelly, I'm hoping you can come in to discuss some behavioral changes we've noticed with Emma. Do you have time this afternoon?" My stomach dropped. "Is she in trouble? Is she hurt?" "She's not in trouble, no. But she's been saying some things that concern us, and her teacher thinks it would be helpful if we could all talk together." Lincoln Elementary School smelled like disinfectant and construction paper, triggering memories of my own childhood and the parent-teacher conferences I'd attended with Sarah before everything fell apart. Mrs. Patterson, Emma's second-grade teacher, met me in the main office, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the patient demeanor that comes from years of managing 7-year-olds. "Thank you for coming," Mrs. Rodriguez said, leading us to her small office decorated with motivational posters and children's artwork. "Emma's academic performance is fine, but we've noticed some concerning statements during class discussions and playground interactions." She pulled out a folder containing what looked like incident reports and examples of Emma's schoolwork. "Last week, during our community helpers unit, Emma told the class that soldiers are bad people who hurt kids in other countries. When Mrs. Patterson asked her to explain, she said her grandfather had told her that's what soldiers do instead of staying home with their families." I felt heat rising in my chest, but forced myself to remain calm. "What else?" Mrs. Patterson leaned forward. "Yesterday, during recess, another child mentioned that her uncle was in the Navy. Emma told her that her uncle was probably mean like my dad and that military people only care about fighting, not about their kids." The counselor's report detailed several similar incidents, Emma repeating phrases that were clearly adult opinions, presented as facts, expressing confusion about whether she should be proud or ashamed of my service, and showing signs of anxiety when other children talked about their parents' jobs. "The most concerning incident happened this morning," Mrs. Rodriguez continued. "During art time, Emma drew a picture of her family. She included her mother, her brother, her grandparents, and her mother's boyfriend. When Mrs. Patterson asked about her father, Emma said he doesn't count as family because he chose the army instead of us." The words hit me like physical blows. My own daughter had been taught to erase me from her concept of family, to see my service as evidence of rejection rather than protection. "Mr. Donnelly," Mrs. Patterson said gently, "we see this sometimes in military families, especially after deployment or during family transitions. Children often struggle to understand why a parent has to leave, and they can internalize narratives that help them make sense of complicated situations. But Emma's narrative isn't coming from her own processing," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "It's coming from her grandparents, who have been systematically teaching her to see my military service as abandonment." The two women exchanged glances. Mrs. Rodriguez made a note in Emma's file. "We can't address what happens outside school," she said carefully, "but we can provide Emma with support here. I'd like to recommend some counseling sessions to help her work through her feelings about family structure and military service. Sometimes children benefit from having a neutral adult help them process conflicting messages they're receiving." Mrs. Patterson nodded. "We also have resources for military families, books, activities, ways to help children understand and take pride in their parents' service. If you're interested, I can send some materials home." As I walked back to my truck with a folder full of documentation about my daughter's confusion and pain, I realized that the Hartwells campaign had succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. They hadn't just damaged my relationship with Emma, they damaged her relationship with herself, teaching her to be ashamed of half her identity and confused about what family loyalty actually meant. But Mrs. Rodriguez had also given me something valuable. official documentation from trained professionals that Emma's behavioral changes were linked to specific external influences. Patricia Chambers had said, I needed evidence of measurable harm to the children. Now I had it. The small digital recorder I purchased felt like a betrayal in my hands. Patricia Chambers had been clear about Maryland's two-party consent laws. But she'd also mentioned that if the other party was actively harming my children, there might be exceptions worth exploring. Document everything, she'd said during our follow-up meeting. Dates, times, witnesses, exact quotes. If they're systematically alienating your children, we need proof that will hold up in court. The first recording I made was during a regular pickup on Friday evening. I tucked the device into my jacket pocket and activated it before knocking on the Hartwell's door, my heart pounding with the knowledge that I was crossing a line I'd never crossed before. Margaret answered with her usual cold smile. Emma, Jake, your father is here for his weekend visit. The children appeared with their overnight bags, Emma dragging her feet and Jake looking uncertain. Have a good time playing army with your dad, Robert called from the living room, his voice carrying just enough edge to sound like a joke to anyone who didn't know better. Grandpa, Daddy doesn't play army, Emma said with 7-year-old logic. He's too old for playing. Margaret's laugh was sharp. Oh honey, some people never grow out of playing pretend. Your daddy likes to pretend he's protecting people, but really he just likes the uniforms and the attention. I bit down on my immediate response and instead said, kids, say goodbye to your grandparents. We'll see you Sunday evening. As we walked to my truck, Jake tugged on my sleeve. Daddy, what did Grandma mean about pretending? That night, after the children were asleep in my apartment, I listened to the recording with a mixture of vindication and disgust. Margaret's words were clear, her intent obvious, and her disregard for the children's emotional well-being stunning in its casual cruelty. Over the next 2 weeks, I gathered similar evidence during every interaction with the Robert explaining to Jake that real men don't run away from their families to play with guns. Margaret telling Emma that Daddy's medals are just participation trophies for showing up. Both of them consistently framing my service in the most negative possible terms while the children listened and absorbed. The journal Patricia had recommended became a detailed chronicle of systematic emotional manipulation. March 15th. Emma asked why I wanted to hurt people instead of staying home. March 18th. Jake repeated Robert's claim that soldiers are just bullies with uniforms. March 22nd. Both children seemed surprised when I told them I loved them, as if affection from me was unexpected. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source: to children themselves. During one of our Saturday morning breakfasts, Jake was playing with his pancakes and talking about school when he mentioned a presentation about careers. Mrs. Wilson said we should be proud of our parents' jobs, he said but Grandpa says I shouldn't tell people you're a soldier, because they'll think our family is bad. Emma nodded seriously. Grandma says soldiers make other kids sad because they take their daddies away to wars. She says that's what you did too. Us. I set down my coffee cup with hands that were suddenly unsteady. What do you think about that? Emma shrugged with the devastating honesty of childhood. I don't know. I miss you when you're not here. But Grandma says that's your fault for choosing army instead of us. But I don't remember you choosing. I just remember you going away and then coming back different. The word different hung in the air like an accusation. Different because I'd been wounded. Different because I'd seen things no person should see. Different because I'd saved lives and nearly lost my own, and couldn't explain any of it to the people I loved most. That evening, I called Patricia and told her I was ready to move forward with legal action. The recordings are helpful, she said after reviewing my evidence. But what we really have here is documentation of a clear pattern of parental alienation. The school counselor's report, combined with your journal entries and the children's own statements, paints a picture that should concern any family court judge. What happens next? We file a motion to modify the custody arrangement and request supervised visitation for the grandparents. We argue that their behavior constitutes emotional abuse and is causing measurable harm to the children's psychological well-being. The words emotional abuse felt both accurate and overwhelming. I'd served in combat zones, faced enemy fire, and walked through minefields. But nothing had prepared me for the realization that I was about to take legal action against my own family in order to protect my children from people who claimed to love them. The decision to confront Robert and Margaret Hartwell directly came after a sleepless night spent staring at a family photo from Emma's 4th birthday, back when we were all still pretending to be happy, before the final deployment. That had changed everything. In the picture, Robert was pushing Emma on a swing while Margaret held baby Jake. And Sarah and I stood together, our arms around each other, smiling like people who believed their happiness was permanent. I arrived at their house on a Saturday morning when I knew the children would be at soccer practice with Sarah. The suburban neighborhood looked peaceful in the spring sunshine, well-maintained lawns, American flags on several porches, the kind of community where military families were supposed to be welcomed and respected. Margaret answered the door, wearing gardening gloves and a surprised expression that quickly shifted to poorly concealed annoyance. "Easton, the children aren't here, I know. I came to talk to you and Robert." She hesitated, clearly weighing the social awkwardness of refusing against the inconvenience of letting me in. Politeness won, barely. "Robert's in his study," she said, leading me through the living room, where Emma and Jake spent so much of their time, absorbing poison disguised as grandparental wisdom. Robert looked up from his computer with the expression of a man interrupted during important work. At 62, he still carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in most rooms. His insurance agency had made him wealthy and influential, and he was used to people deferring to his opinions. "What can we do for you, Easton?" he asked, not bothering to stand or offer me a seat. I remained standing as well, holding the family photo in my hands like evidence. "We need to talk about what you've been telling my children about my military service." Margaret's laugh was sharp and defensive. "We've been telling them the truth. That you chose to abandon your family to play soldier in foreign countries." "Play soldier?" I repeated the phrase slowly, letting it hang in the air. "Is that what you think I was doing in Afghanistan? Playing?" Robert leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who'd never been challenged on his version of reality. "I think you made choices, Easton. You chose deployment over family time. You chose the excitement of military life over the responsibility of being a present father. You chose a career that took you away from your wife and children repeatedly, and now you want to blame everyone else for the consequences." The casual dismissal of 15 years of service, of sacrifice, of genuine danger and genuine heroism hit me like a physical blow, but I'd expected it. What I hadn't expected was the depth of my own anger, the way their words could still wound me even when I knew they were lies. "Do you want to know what I was really doing on my last deployment?" I asked quietly. Margaret waved her hand dismissively. "We know what you were doing," Sarah told us. "Building roads and checking for bombs. Important work, I'm sure, but hardly worth destroying a marriage over." Sarah didn't know what I was really doing, I said. She couldn't know, because most of it was classified, but it's been declassified now, and I think you should hear the actual story. Before you continue telling my children that their father is a selfish coward who abandoned them for fun. Something in my tone must have penetrated their certainty, because Robert's expression shifted slightly. "What are you talking about?" he asked. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a manila folder containing documents I'd never shown to anyone outside official channels. The field reports, medical records, and commendation letters that told the real story of my extended deployment. March 15, 2019. I began setting the first document on Robert's desk. My unit received intelligence about a coordinated attack on a refugee camp housing 186 displaced civilians, mostly women and children. The camp was located between insurgent forces and an unmarked minefield. Standard evacuation protocols would have taken too long. The civilians would have been slaughtered. Margaret's gardening gloves looked incongruous as she reached for the document, her face showing the first crack in her absolute certainty. "I led a team into that minefield," I continued, placing the Bronze Star citation on top of the field report. "I personally escorted 30 civilians to safety, one at a time, through an area so heavily mined that one wrong step would have killed us both. The last person I saved was a 6-year-old boy whose parents had been killed in the fighting." The room fell silent, except for the sound of pages turning as Robert read the official account of the mission that had earned me the Bronze Star for valor. The silence stretched for nearly a minute as Robert read the Bronze Star citation, his face growing paler with each line. Margaret had stopped pretending to examine the documents, and was instead staring at me with something approaching shock. "The boy I saved was hit by shrapnel from incoming mortar fire," I continued, placing the medical records on the desk. "So was I. The shrapnel opened my femoral artery and caused nerve damage that required multiple surgeries and for months of recovery time." I spread out the hospital records, the surgical reports, the physical therapy evaluations, the paper trail of what the Hartwells had characterized as an extended vacation from family responsibility. Those for months, I was playing soldier. I was learning to walk again. I was dealing with nightmares so severe that I couldn't sleep for more than 2 hours at a time. I was struggling with survivor's guilt because I lived and that boy's parents didn't. And I was trying to figure out how to come home to my family and pretend everything was normal when nothing would ever be normal again. Margaret's hands were shaking slightly as she picked up one of the commendation letters, a formal document from my commanding officer describing the rescue operation in detail. But here's what really happened, I said, my voice getting steadier as their certainty crumbled. I came home different because I'd seen things you can't imagine and done things that were necessary but horrible. I was struggling with PTSD and physical disabilities and the knowledge that I'd saved lives but couldn't save my marriage. And instead of getting support from my family, I got accusations of abandonment from people who had never risked anything for anyone. Robert set down the citation and looked at me directly for the first time since I'd arrived. Easton, we didn't know. You didn't want to know, I interrupted. You wanted a simple story that made Sarah the victim and me the villain. You wanted to believe that military service is just playing soldier, that deployment is just an excuse to avoid responsibility, that men like me choose danger over family because we're selfish or broken or addicted to adrenaline. I pulled out the final document, a letter from the Afghan family I'd helped evacuate, written in careful English and delivered through official channels 6 months after the rescue. This came last week, I said, handing it to Margaret. It's from the grandmother of the boy I saved. She wanted me to know that he's in school now, in Germany, and that he tells people he wants to be an American soldier, like the man who carried him to safety. Margaret read the letter aloud, her voice breaking slightly. Dear Sergeant Donnelly, my grandson Tariq speaks of you every day. He says you were not afraid in the scary place with the bombs. He says you told him soldiers protect people, especially children. He draws pictures of you in your uniform and says when he grows up, he wants to protect children too, like the American soldier who saved his life. The room fell silent again, but this time it was a different kind of quiet, not the uncomfortable pause of people avoiding truth, but the heavy silence of people confronting the magnitude of their mistakes. Robert cleared his throat. Easton, if we had known, you could have known, I said. You could have asked questions instead of making assumptions. You could have considered that there might be more to the story than your need to blame someone for your daughter's divorce. You could have given me the benefit of the doubt that comes with 15 years of honorable service. Margaret was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks as she clutched the letter from Afghanistan. We thought Sarah was so hurt, and the children missed you so much. And it was easier to make me the villain than to accept that sometimes good people face impossible choices, and everyone gets hurt anyway, I finished. It was easier to teach my children to be ashamed of their father than to help them understand that sacrifice and service are complicated. That love sometimes requires doing difficult things. That families can survive hardship if they support each other, instead of assigning blame. I began gathering the documents, putting the evidence of my service back into its folder, like classified intelligence being secured after a briefing. But here's what you really need to understand, I said, looking at both of them directly. For the past 2 years, you've been teaching Emma and Jake that their father is a selfish man who abandoned them to play army. You've been systematically destroying their ability to trust me, to take pride in military service, to understand that protection sometimes requires sacrifice. You've been committing emotional abuse against your own grandchildren in the name of supporting your daughter. Robert's face had gone from pale to flushed. We were trying to help them process. You were trying to rewrite history to make yourselves feel better about your role in the collapse of my marriage, I said, and you were willing to sacrifice my children's emotional well-being to do it. I stood to leave, then turned back one final time. I'm filing legal papers to modify the custody arrangement. Your unsupervised access to Emma and Jake is going to end until you can demonstrate that you're capable of supporting their relationship with both their parents instead of poisoning it. And if you ever refer to my military service as playing soldier in front of my children again, I will make sure everyone in this community knows exactly what you think of the men and women who risk their lives to protect the freedoms you take for granted. The last thing I saw as I left was Margaret still holding the letter from Afghanistan, staring at it like a piece of evidence that had just overturned everything she thought she knew about justice. 2 days after my confrontation with the Hartwells, I made the decision I'd been avoiding for 2 years. I was going to tell my children the complete truth about my military service, in language they could understand and process safely. Sarah agreed to bring Emma and Jake to my apartment on a Sunday afternoon. She'd been different since our conversation, in her kitchen, more thoughtful, less defensive, asking careful questions about things she'd never wanted to discuss before. When she arrived with the children, she lingered in the doorway. "Are you sure about this?" she asked quietly. "They're still pretty young for their old enough to understand the difference between truth and lies," I said. "And they deserve better than the version of their father that your parents have been feeding them." Emma and Jake settled on my couch with the careful attention children give to conversations they sense are important. I sat across from them, holding the complete Bronze Star citation, not just the summary they'd issued for public consumption, but the detailed account that had been classified until recently. "I want to tell you a story," I began, "about what Daddy was really doing the last time he had to go away for work." Emma's expression was skeptical in the way of 7-year-olds who've been disappointed before. "Grandpa says you were just playing Army." "I know that's what Grandpa says, but I want you to hear what really happened, and then you can decide for yourself what you think." I told them about the refugee camp, using simple language to explain that families had been forced to leave their homes because of fighting and were living in temporary shelters while waiting for help. I explained about the dangerous people who wanted to hurt these families, and about the hidden bombs in the ground that made it unsafe for anyone to move. "There were kids there," I said, watching Jake's eyes widen. "Kids your age, Emma, and even younger than you, Jake. They couldn't get to safety because of the bombs, and the bad people were getting closer." "What did you do?" Jake asked, leaning forward with the intense focus he usually reserved for superhero stories. "My job was to find the bombs and mark them so people could walk around them safely. It's very dangerous work. You have to be extremely careful and know exactly what you're doing, or you could get hurt." I showed them a photograph from the mission, not the graphic images of the minefield, but a picture of my unit with some of the civilian contractors before the emergency began. Emma studied my face in the photo. "You look scared," she said. "I was scared," I admitted. "Being scared doesn't mean you don't do your job. It means you understand that what you're doing is dangerous and important, and you do it anyway, because people need help." I explained about walking the civilians to safety one at a time, about the little boy who reminded me of Jake, about getting hurt while trying to protect people. Sarah had moved closer during the story, sitting on the arm of my chair like she used to do when we were married. "The reason Daddy was gone for so long," she said softly, "wasn't because he wanted to stay away from us. It was because he got hurt helping those families, and he needed time to get better." Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing, then she asked the question I'd been dreading. "Why didn't you tell us before?" "Because some parts of military work are secrets that soldiers aren't allowed to talk about, even to their families. And because when I came home, I was sad and hurt, and didn't know how to explain what had happened without making you scared or worried." Jake climbed onto my lap, something he hadn't done in months. "Did you save the little boy?" "I did. And he's safe now, living with his grandmother in a place where there's no fighting. In fact, I pulled out the letter from Afghanistan. His grandmother sent me a letter to say thank you." I read them the appropriate parts of the letter, watching their faces change as they processed the idea that their father had genuinely saved lives. That somewhere in the world, a child their age was alive because of actions they'd been taught to see as abandonment. "So when Grandpa says you were playing Army," Emma said slowly, "he's wrong." "Grandpa didn't know the real story," I said carefully. "But yes, he was wrong. Soldiers don't play. We work very hard at a very serious job. We protect people who can't protect themselves, even when it's dangerous for us." Emma was quiet for another moment, then asked, "Are you proud of being a soldier?" The question hit me harder than I'd expected. For 2 years, I'd been so focused on defending my service against attacks that I'd forgotten to celebrate it, to take pride in the good I'd done, to model for my children what it meant to serve something larger than yourself. "Yes," I said, looking at both of them directly. "I'm very proud. And I hope someday you'll be proud of me too." The handwritten letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by Sarah herself, rather than through the mail. She stood on my doorstep holding the envelope like it contained something fragile and important. "I wrote this last night," she said, without preamble, "after the kids went to bed, and I had time to really think about everything you told them Sunday." The letter was written on the cream-colored stationery she'd always used for important occasions. Thank you notes. Sympathy cards. The kind of correspondence that required thought and care. Her familiar handwriting covered 3 pages in blue ink. "Easton," it began. "I owe you an apology. That's 2 years overdue, and probably inadequate for the damage that's been done." I looked up at Sarah, who was watching my face as I read. "You don't have to read it now," she said quickly. I needed you to have it. To know that I understand, finally, what I allowed to happen. But I continued reading, standing in my doorway while she waited. I was angry when you came back from Afghanistan, different than when you left. I was exhausted from single parenting and resentful of the sacrifices I'd made while you were gone. When my parents offered explanations that made you the villain and me the victim, I accepted them because they were easier than acknowledging my own failures as a partner and a mother. I let my parents poison our children against you because their version of events supported my decision to end our marriage. I convinced myself that their obvious bias was actually clarity, that their cruel characterizations of your service were actually tough love for Emma and Jake. I was wrong about everything. You didn't abandon us to play soldier. You served your country with honor and distinction. You saved lives at great personal cost. And you came home wounded in ways I was too self-centered to recognize or support. Instead of getting the hero's welcome you deserved from your family, you got accusations and alienation from people who should have been proud of your sacrifice. I failed you as a wife when you needed me most. I failed our children by allowing them to be taught shame instead of pride about their father's service. And I failed myself by choosing the easy narrative over the true one. My hands were shaking slightly as I turned to the second page. I can't undo the damage that's been done, but I can commit to doing better going forward. I've already had a very difficult conversation with my parents about their behavior and the lies they've been telling Emma and Jake. They're ashamed of themselves, though not as ashamed as I am of my role in enabling them. I want to work together to repair the children's relationship with you and their understanding of military service. I want them to be proud of their father instead of confused about why he chose the army over them. I want to be the co-parent you deserved from the beginning instead of the bitter ex-wife. I know I don't have the right to ask for your forgiveness, and I know an apology letter can't fix 2 years of damage, but I need you to know that I see clearly now what I refused to see before. You are a good man who made impossible choices in service of others. And our children are lucky to have you as their father. The letter was signed simply Sarah. Underneath her name she'd added a postscript that made my throat tight. Emma drew a new picture yesterday. It shows you in your uniform with a medal, and underneath she wrote, "My daddy the hero. I thought you should know." I looked up to find Sarah watching me with an expression I hadn't seen since before my final deployment, vulnerable, hopeful, and genuinely remorseful. "Sarah, I know we can't go back," she said quickly. "I know too much has happened for us to be anything other than co-parents, but I want us to be good co-parents. I want our kids to see their father clearly, to understand that service and sacrifice are admirable, that their family fell apart because life is complicated, not because their daddy didn't love them enough to stay." I folded the letter carefully, feeling something shift in my chest that I hadn't expected. Not forgiveness exactly, but the possibility of it. Not reconciliation, but the hope for peace. "The custody modification hearing is next week," I said. "Patricia thinks the judge will restrict your parents' access to the kids until they can demonstrate that they won't continue the alienation campaign." Sarah nodded. "Good. They need time to examine their behavior and figure out how to be grandparents instead of prosecutors. And Emma and Jake need time to rebuild their relationship with you without constant interference." She turned to leave, then paused. "Easton, I know I don't deserve to ask this, but would you consider family counseling? Not couples therapy," she added quickly, "but sessions with all 4 of us to help the kids process everything and learn how to be a healthy divorced family." The request surprised me, but so did my immediate impulse to say yes. "I'll think about it. Thank you for everything. For your service. For fighting for our kids. For being patient with me while I figured out how wrong I'd been." As I watched her drive away, I realized that for the first time in 2 years, I felt hopeful about my family's future. Emma's new drawing was taped to my refrigerator within an hour of Sarah giving it to me. Unlike her previous artwork that showed Daddy playing war, this picture depicted a figure in military uniform with a prominent medal on his chest, standing next to a group of small figures labeled "Kids I Saved." At the bottom, in her careful second-grade handwriting, she'd written "My daddy the hero" in red crayon. The transformation in my children's understanding didn't happen overnight, but it began immediately. During our next visit, Jake brought a book about military vehicles he'd checked out from the school library and wanted me to explain the difference between the trucks I'd driven and the ones in the pictures. Emma asked thoughtful questions about what it felt like to be scared but do your job anyway. "Were you more scared in Afghanistan, or when you had to tell us the truth about what happened there?" she asked with the brutal honesty of childhood. "Telling you the truth," I admitted, "because I was more afraid of losing you than I was of getting hurt myself." The breakthrough moment came 2 weeks later, during a Saturday afternoon visit when we were making pancakes in my small kitchen. Emma was stirring batter while Jake arranged blueberries in precise patterns. And I was watching them work with the quiet contentment that comes from ordinary moments with your children. "Daddy," Emma said without looking up from her mixing bowl, "I told Mrs. Patterson about your Bronze Star." My heart clenched slightly. "What did you tell her?" "I told her you saved kids in Afghanistan and got hurt doing it. She said that makes you a hero. And she asked if you could come talk to our class about military service." The invitation to speak at Emma's school felt like validation in a way I hadn't expected. Here was my daughter, who'd been taught to be ashamed of my service, now wanting to share it with her classmates. The shy pride in her voice when she asked was worth every difficult conversation we'd had. Jake looked up from his blueberry arrangement. "Can I tell my class too? About how you carried the little boy to safety?" "You can tell anyone you want," I said, feeling something tight in my chest begin to loosen. "But remember, the important thing isn't that people think I'm a hero. The important thing is that you understand soldiers have an important job protecting people, and that job sometimes requires difficult choices, like going away from your family to help other families," Emma said, demonstrating the kind of mature understanding that had been impossible when her grandparents were actively undermining it. Exactly like that. That afternoon, Sarah picked up the children for their regular transition back to her house. Instead of the usual rushed handoff, she lingered to talk while Emma and Jake gathered their belongings. "They're different," she said quietly. "Happier, more confident." Emma actually corrected my mother yesterday when she made a comment about military families. "What kind of comment?" "Something about how hard it is on children when their fathers choose dangerous careers." Emma told her that soldiers don't choose danger, they choose to protect people, and that she's proud to be a soldier's daughter. The phrase soldier's daughter hit me with unexpected force. For 2 years, Emma had been taught to see military connection as something shameful, a burden she carried because of her father's poor choices. Now she was claiming it as part of her identity. "How did your mother react?" Sarah's smile was rueful. She cried, "She's been doing that a lot lately. I think the reality of what they did to you two, all of us, is finally sinking in." As she loaded the kids into her car, Emma rolled down the window to call out one final thing. "Daddy, I'm going to draw you another picture for next weekend. One that shows you teaching me to be brave like soldiers are." Watching them drive away, I realized that healing wasn't just about correcting false narratives or fighting legal battles. It was about rebuilding trust, one conversation at a time, one honest moment at a time, one crayon drawing that showed love instead of shame. My children were learning to be proud of their father again. More importantly, they were learning that service and sacrifice were values worth respecting, that protecting others sometimes required difficult choices, and that love could survive misunderstanding if people were willing to fight for truth. The little boy in Afghanistan who'd told me he wanted to be a soldier like me would understand what Emma was discovering, that heroes aren't people who aren't afraid. They're people who are afraid but choose to act anyway, because some things are more important than personal safety. My children were learning to be brave. The family court hearing took place on a Thursday morning, in a sterile courtroom that smelled of disinfectant and old paper. Judge Patricia Morrison was a woman in her 50s, with gray hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd heard every variety of family dysfunction and retained her capacity for moral clarity. Patricia Chambers had prepared me for the proceedings. But sitting in the defendant's chair, while my former in-laws were questioned about their grandparent rights, felt surreal. Robert wore his best suit, and the expression of a man who'd never been challenged in an official capacity. Margaret clutched a tissue and looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. "Mr. Hartwell," Judge Morrison began, "I've reviewed the evidence submitted by the petitioner, including recordings of statements you made in the presence of the minor children. Can you explain why you told a 6-year-old boy that his father likes to play with guns and pretend he's in movies?" Robert's attorney, a nervous young man who clearly wished he was anywhere else, had advised his client to be, but Robert's natural arrogance was hard to suppress. "Your Honor, we were simply trying to help the children process their father's prolonged absences in age-appropriate terms by characterizing military service as play acting. We didn't have access to classified information about Sergeant Donnelly's specific duties. We based our understanding on what appeared to be repeated deployments that coincided with periods of marital difficulty." Judge Morrison's expression suggested she was not impressed with this reasoning. She turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Hartwell, You were recorded telling your granddaughter that soldiers make other kids sad because they take their daddies away to wars. Can you explain the educational value of teaching a 7-year-old to be ashamed of military service? Margaret's voice was barely audible. I was angry about my daughter's divorce. I blamed Easton for the family falling apart, and I said things I shouldn't have said. You said things designed to alienate the children from their father, Judge Morrison corrected. The school counselor's report indicates that Emma Donnelly exhibited signs of confusion and anxiety about her father's military service, directly traceable to statements made in your home. Patricia Chambers stood to present the evidence. We'd gathered the recordings, the children's statements, the school reports, and most damningly, the complete record of my Bronze Star citation and the medical documentation of my injuries. Your Honor, Patricia said. The respondents engaged in a systematic campaign to rewrite history, teaching these children that their father's distinguished military service was actually abandonment, that his Bronze Star for valor was meaningless, and that his recovery from combat injuries was an excuse to avoid family responsibility. She placed the citation on the judge's desk. Sergeant Donnelly didn't abandon his family to play army. He saved 186 civilian lives in Afghanistan, personally escorted 30 people through an active minefield, and was wounded while protecting a child the same age as his son. His prolonged absence was medical recovery at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. Judge Morrison read the citation in silence, her expression growing more severe. When she looked up, her gaze fixed on Robert and Margaret with obvious displeasure. Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell, you have systematically undermined these children's relationship with their father based on willful ignorance of facts that were available to you. You characterized heroic military service as selfish abandonment. You dismissed genuine sacrifice as play acting. And you used your position as grandparents to inflict emotional harm on children who needed support and stability. Margaret was crying openly now. We didn't know. You didn't want to know, Judge Morrison interrupted. You preferred a narrative that supported your daughter's divorce over one that required you to acknowledge your son-in-law's service and sacrifice. That preference has caused measurable psychological harm to your grandchildren. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Robert and Margaret's access to Emma and Jake would be supervised for 6 months. With all visits taking place in the presence of a court-appointed monitor, they would be required to attend family counseling focused on parental alienation. And any future contact with the children would be contingent on their demonstrated ability to support the children's relationship with both parents. Furthermore, Judge Morrison continued, I am modifying the custody arrangement to increase Sergeant Donnelly's parenting time to alternate weeks, with additional time during school breaks. The evidence suggests that the children benefit from increased contact with their father and decreased exposure to alienating influences. As we left the courthouse, Patricia shook my hand with genuine satisfaction. That was about as decisive a victory as you could hope for in a case like this. But the real victory came that evening, when Sarah called to tell me that Emma had asked if she could keep her new drawing of Daddy the Hero on her bedroom wall instead of hiding it in her backpack. She wants people to see it, Sarah said. She wants them to know her father is a soldier and that she's proud of that. The custody schedule was just paper. The pride in my daughter's voice was transformation. The Veterans Affairs Counseling Center occupied a modern building on the outskirts of town, its waiting room filled with men and women of various ages who shared the particular alertness that comes from military training and the particular weariness that comes from battles fought both overseas and at home. Dr. Maria Vasquez was a clinical psychologist who specialized in combat, trauma, and family reintegration. She was also a Navy veteran, which meant she understood the unique challenges of explaining military life to people who'd never lived it. You've been carrying 2 kinds of trauma, she said during our 3rd session. The obvious kind from Afghanistan, and the less obvious kind from having your service attacked by your own family. Both are real, and both need attention. The appointment card in my wallet had become a symbol of commitment, not just to healing, but to being the father Emma and Jake deserved. I'd resisted therapy for years, partly from military-bred stoicism, and partly from the belief that seeking help would validate the Hartwells' claims about my weakness. What changed your mind about counseling? Dr. Vasquez asked. My daughter drew a picture of me as a hero, I said, and I realized I needed to become the man she thinks I am. The work was harder than I'd expected. Combat trauma was straightforward compared to family trauma in Afghanistan. I'd known who the enemy was. At home, the people hurting me claimed to love my children. The people I'd tried to protect had been turned against me by people who were supposed to support our family. Parental alienation is a form of psychological warfare, Dr. Vasquez explained. It's designed to destabilize your relationship with your children by rewriting history and reframing love as abandonment. The fact that you recognized it and fought back shows strength, not weakness. Emma and Jake were adapting to the new custody arrangement better than I'd dared hope. Having them for full weeks instead of weekend visits allowed us to establish routines and create the kind of ordinary family moments that build deep connections. Emma helped me plan meals, and Jake supervised my attempts at bedtime stories. "Daddy," Jake said, one evening as I tucked him into bed, "why did Grandpa and Grandma say those mean things about soldiers?" It was a question I'd been expecting, but still wasn't fully prepared to answer. "Sometimes when people are hurt or angry, they look for someone to blame," I said carefully. "Grandpa and Grandma were sad about Mommy and Daddy getting divorced, and they decided it was my fault. Instead of trying to understand what really happened, they made up a story that made me the bad guy." "But you're not the bad guy," Emma said from her bed across the room. "You're the hero who saved the kids." "I'm just a person who tried to do the right thing," I corrected gently. "Sometimes that meant going away to help people who needed help. Sometimes it meant coming home to take care of you and Jake. Sometimes it meant standing up to people who were saying hurtful things about our family." The breakthrough in family healing came during one of our sessions with Dr. Jennifer Walsh. The family counselor Sarah had requested. Emma had been struggling with divided loyalties. She loved her grandparents, but was beginning to understand that they'd been wrong about me. "It's okay to love people who make mistakes," Dr. Walsh told her. "Grandpa and Grandma were wrong about your daddy, but that doesn't mean they're bad people or that you can't love them. It just means they need to learn how to be better grandparents." Sarah had been attending individual counseling as well, working through her own guilt about enabling the alienation campaign. During our joint sessions, she was making genuine efforts to rebuild trust and establish healthy co-parenting boundaries. "I want Emma and Jake to see that divorced parents can still work together for their children," she said during one session. "I want them to know that love doesn't end just because marriage does, and that they don't have to choose sides in adult conflicts." The new family traditions we were building felt organic and sustainable. Friday night pizza and movie nights at my apartment. Saturday morning pancakes where the kids took turns choosing toppings. Sunday afternoon walks where we talked about everything and nothing. The kind of meandering conversations that let children process complex emotions at their own pace. "Are you still sad about Afghanistan?" Emma asked during one of these walks. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but I'm getting better at talking about it instead of keeping it inside. That's why I go to counseling, to learn how to be sad about hard things without letting the sadness take over my whole life." "Is that why you and Mummy got divorced? Because you were too sad to talk about it?" The question was more perceptive than I'd expected from a 7-year-old, and more painful. "That was part of it," I said. "When I came home from my last deployment, I was hurt and sad and angry, and I didn't know how to explain what had happened to me. Mummy was hurt and sad too, because she'd been taking care of you and Jake by herself for so long. We both needed help, but we didn't know how to ask for it or give it to each other." "But you're getting help now," Jake observed with 6-year-old logic. "We're all getting help now," I agreed. "And that's making everything better." 6 months after the custody hearing, I received an envelope that would close the circle on the most difficult chapter of my life. The return address was unfamiliar, Refugee Resettlement Office in Berlin, but the careful handwriting on the front was recognizable from the first letter I'd received from Afghanistan. Inside was a thank you card made by hand, with a drawing that looked remarkably similar to Emma's artwork. A figure in military uniform stood next to a small boy, and underneath, in English letters, carefully copied from someone else's writing, were the words, "Thank you, American soldier." The accompanying letter was from Amara, the elderly woman I'd escorted through the minefield, writing on behalf of her grandson Tariq, a 6-year-old boy I'd been carrying when the mortar round exploded. "Dear Sergeant Donnelly," the letter began. "Tariq is now 7 years old, and doing well in school, here in Germany. He still talks about the brave American soldier who carried him to safety. And he has decided he wants to study engineering, so he can help build safe places for children. Like you did for him. We wanted you to know that the lives you saved that day in Afghanistan are lives well lived. The children you rescued are in school, the families are rebuilding, and the boy you carried through the dangerous place wants to grow up to protect others just like you taught him soldiers do. Tariq asks me to tell you that he draws pictures of soldiers now, and they are always protecting children, never hurting them. He says you taught him that soldiers are people who keep kids safe, and he wants other children to know this too. We hope your own children understand how proud they should be of their father's courage and kindness. In our prayers, we ask Allah to bless your family with happiness and peace, because you gave our family the gift of life itself. I was reading the letter at my kitchen table when Emma and Jake arrived for their weekend visit. They found me sitting, with tears in my eyes, holding the card Tariq had made. "What's wrong, Daddy?" Emma asked with the immediate concern children show when they see adults emotional. "Nothing's wrong," I said, pulling them both into my lap. "Something's very right. Remember the little boy I told you about? The one from Afghanistan who reminded me of Jake?" They nodded, settling in to listen. "He sent me a card to say thank you, and to tell me he's doing well in school, and he wanted you to know that he tells people soldiers are heroes who protect children." Jake studied the drawing with the intense focus he usually reserved for his favorite books. "He draws like Emma does. All kids draw soldiers the same way. When they understand what soldiers really do," I said, "they draw them protecting people instead of hurting them." Emma took the letter and examined it carefully, sounding out the words she could read. "Daddy, can we write him back?" "We can try," I said. "What would you want to tell him?" "That I'm proud to be a soldier's daughter," Emma said immediately, "and that I hope he stays safe until he grows up to be an engineer who helps people." That evening, as we sat together writing a letter to a child in Germany who understood my service better than my former in-laws ever had, I realized that the circle of healing was complete. The boy I'd saved in Afghanistan was thriving and dreaming of a future where he could protect others. My own children were proud of their father's service, and learning that love sometimes requires sacrifice. Sarah and I were building a healthy, co-parenting relationship based on truth instead of bitterness. Even Robert and Margaret were slowly coming around. Their supervised visits had evolved into genuine efforts to repair their relationship with Emma and Jake. And Margaret had recently asked if she could attend one of Emma's school presentations about military families. "I want to learn how to be a grandmother who builds up instead of tears down," she'd told Sarah. "I want Emma and Jake to know I'm proud of their father, even though it took me too long to understand what there was to be proud of." The Bronze Star citation still sat in my safe, but it was no longer hidden like classified intelligence. Emma had asked to see it for her school report on heroes, and Jake had announced to his class that his daddy had saved 30 people and gotten a medal for being brave. As I tucked my children into bed that night, Emma asked one final question. "Daddy, when I grow up, can I be brave like you?" "You're already brave," I told her. "You were brave when you started asking hard questions about things that confused you. You were brave when you decided to be proud of your family instead of ashamed. You were brave when you chose to love people even when other people told you not to." "That's different kind of brave than soldier brave," Jake observed. "It's the most important kind of brave," I said. "Because anyone can learn to be physically courageous when they have to be. But choosing to love, choosing to forgive, choosing to see the truth even when lies are easier, that's the kind of brave that changes the world." 6 months earlier, my daughter had asked me why I abandoned her to play army. Now she was falling asleep, clutching a drawing she'd made of our family, all of us together, including her grandparents, with me in my uniform and my bronze star clearly visible on my chest. The transformation wasn't just in my children's understanding of my service, but in their understanding of what family meant. They'd learned that love could survive misunderstanding, that adults could make mistakes and still be good people, and that truth was always worth fighting for, even when it was difficult. As I turned off their bedroom light and headed to my own room, I thought about the letter from Amara and her grandson's drawing of a soldier protecting a child. Somewhere in Germany, a 7-year-old boy was dreaming of becoming an engineer who could build safe places for families. Here in Maryland, my own 7-year-old daughter was dreaming of being brave in her own way, proud of her father's service, and confident in her family's love. The Bronze Star citation described my actions in Afghanistan as conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an armed enemy. But the real victory, the one that mattered most, had been won in living rooms and school counselors' offices, in custody hearings and family therapy sessions, in the slow, patient work of rebuilding trust, one honest conversation at a time. My children knew now that soldiers don't abandon their families to play war. They protect other people's families so their own families can sleep safely. They sacrifice time and comfort, and sometimes their lives, because some things are more important than personal convenience. But more than that, Emma and Jake had learned that their father was someone who would fight for them not just against enemies in foreign countries, but against lies and alienation, and anyone who tried to teach them to be ashamed of love. Disguised as duty, That boy in Afghanistan had told me he wanted to be a soldier when he grew up. My own children were learning something even more valuable. How to be the kind of people worth protecting. How to choose truth over convenience. Love over bitterness. Pride over shame. As I fell asleep that night, I could still hear Emma's voice from our bedtime conversation. Daddy, when I grow up, can I be brave like you? She already was.